Well, I am really excited to share this message with you all today. This is a day that we all look forward to. Like if you're a pastor, this is kind of like Super Bowl Sunday because this is a day you get to tell the story that everybody loves to tell. And everybody comes and they want to hear, and that's the story of the resurrection of Jesus, right? That's why you came. You've probably heard that before, that the reason people gather together is to tell the story of the resurrection of Jesus. We're no different. But the thing that makes us a little bit different here at TCAT is that we feel like there's a really important question that we want you to consider. And I would go as far to say as I think it's the most important question in the world. You may not be there yet, so I won't put that on you. But there's a really important question that we think everybody should have to answer sooner or later. And the point of what I'm going to try to share with you all for the next few minutes is to get you here to answer this question. And it's this: who is Jesus? Right? Because we're going to celebrate his resurrection. If we're going to talk about this idea that he was raised from the grave, and we're going to sing these cool songs, and we're going to gather together and be here for this moment, we ought to really know who that is. And so I hope to kind of answer that question for you today, or at least put you in a place where you start considering it yourself. Now, no matter where you are, if you walked through the door this morning and you just came because your mama promised you lunch when it was done, that's totally cool, okay? If you've been a believer for a really long time, you're going to know a lot of the stuff I'm about to say, but I'm going to try to put it right in the middle to help you answer what this question might be. And to do that, I want to tell you why most of us as Jesus followers believe. We believe because there have been a lot of other people that believed before us. And not just that, it's even more beautiful than that. It's actually more extraordinary than that. We believe in the resurrection of Jesus because a first century follower of Jesus by the name of Matthew came to a place where originally he was looking for the Jewish Messiah. He was someone who was trying to do all the right things and do all the right things. But in the first century, he ran into a guy named Jesus. He followed him around, wrote down some of the things that he said, wrote down some of the things that he saw, talked about the miracles, realized that Jesus really was just something more than just a really great teacher, and ended up writing a book that we call today the Gospel of Matthew. We believe because a Greek by the name of Mark ran into this guy named Peter, bold, brash, emotional Peter, and Peter started telling him stories about this Jesus guy that he'd wandered around the desert with and wandered around the countryside with. And Mark said, "Hey, Peter, tell me that story again. Could you tell me one more time?" And eventually Mark started writing down those stories. And today we call that the Gospel of Matthew. It's stuck as the second book in our New Testament. We believe because there was this doctor by the name of Luke, who was so curious about what had happened with Jesus in the first century that he sat down, and at the beginning of his letter he said, "O great Theophilus, I have sat down as many have, many have, to try to write down exactly what it was that happened with Jesus so that you would know." And Luke was the very first ever investigative reporter, and he went and talked to all the eyewitnesses, and he went and wandered around the countryside. He spent time with Paul, who we'll get to in a minute. He talked to Peter. He met with the disciples that were still alive and said, "Tell me the truth about this Jesus." But Luke also had the benefit of living in the first century church, like the church that was planted right after Jesus went back to heaven, and he met everybody that was there, and he saw the life change. And so Luke wrote down his story, and we call that the Gospel of Luke. Probably my favorite of all of them is we believe because of a guy named James. James was actually the brother of Jesus. And let me ask you this question that I ask all the time: what would your brother have to do to get you to call him your Lord? Right? Anybody? Yeah, exactly. Go ahead. It's exactly what my brother couldn't do that. There's just no way. And in fact, James was not a believer of Jesus in the beginning. In fact, there's no record of James being anywhere near Jesus until after the resurrection. He's like, "I won't believe it until I see it." And that was who James was. And James shows up later on in the New Testament in the book of Acts as a guy who's leading the church in Jerusalem. And James was actually the one who said, "Look, I will go to the grave." In fact, he was martyred because he said, "I am absolutely convinced that my brother is the Lord. He is the Son of God." We believe because Jesus' brother, James, believed. We believe because of a guy named Paul, who started off as a Christian hater and a Christian killer. If you've ever met any Christians that you wanted to throw in jail, you would really like Paul because that's what he did. Paul threw tons of Christians in jail. He couldn't stand them. He thought there was some sort of heresy. And then he met Jesus. And then he became a Christian. And then he became a really great one. And Paul started planting churches all over the Mediterranean rim saying, "Look, this guy Jesus changed my life. He was in the grave and now he's not. And I have met him and my life is not the same." And he wrote letters. This is so amazing. He wrote letters literally from prison. Thousands of years ago, he wrote letters in prison, and thousands of years later, here in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, we get the opportunity to read a letter that he was like, "Man, I hope this gets out." And here it is recorded for all of us today. We believe because Paul believed. We believe because Matthew believed. We believe because Mark believed. We believe because James believed. And here's the truth. Let me just put this out there for you this morning. All of those people were willing to tell this story because something happened. See, the story of Jesus isn't really worth telling apart from the resurrection. I mean, think about it. If Jesus wasn't resurrected, if he was just a really cool teacher who did some neat stuff and he was crucified and he died, we wouldn't really tell that story today. And it definitely wouldn't be something that people would die for. Lots of people have been cool teachers. Maybe you know some people who are amazing teachers in your life, okay? If that's all Jesus was, his story's really not worth telling. And in fact, his disciples literally scattered when they thought that he was going to be condemned to death and that was the end. They ran away screaming and hiding in the dark. The story of Jesus isn't worth telling if he wasn't resurrected. And so thousands of years later, we believe because other people saw. They saw and they experienced something that changed their life. And for thousands and thousands of years, they've been telling that story. And people have gathered on this day, just like we have this morning, because something happened. And what I would love for you to consider this morning is that something that happened might be important for your life and my life and the life of the people that are around us. And maybe just for a moment, maybe just consider that if this really happened, if things happened the way that they said that it happened, if Jesus really was who he said he was, then what does that mean for me today? And maybe perhaps I should answer the question, who is Jesus? There's one more thing you need to understand about his followers. Again, I said it just a moment ago. On Easter Sunday morning, there was no one that was expecting Jesus to walk out of the grave. Nobody went to the tomb expecting nobody. That's the only joke I got in the sermon today. So there you go. You got it. Nobody went to the tomb expecting nobody. They didn't. There was no one standing in the garden going like 10, 9, 8, cue the sunrise, 7, here comes the stone. It just wasn't happening. They all scattered. They were convinced it was over. They were like, this is it. Jesus died on the cross. And in fact, by the time he was arrested, most of his followers started scattering. They're like, I'm not going down with this. Maybe I can go back to my job fishing. Maybe I can go back to my, my life and, my family, and I'll just kind of step back and slither into the shadows, and nobody will know that I was him. I was with him. And so nobody believed. There was no one standing in the garden expecting that. In fact, the followers that went to the garden that morning on Easter Sunday morning were going to help finish preparing his body for burial. They didn't have time. It was such a quick, hurried thing on Friday. They didn't have time to finish. They were going to do a funeral. They weren't going to celebrate Easter. Nobody expected what had happened. Therefore, if we're still telling the story today, what is it that actually happened? And why is it we're telling the story today? Jesus had this miraculous ministry, and there was actually one more eyewitness, one more follower, one more person who believed in Jesus that I want to spend some time talking about this morning, who told the story of Jesus because he was there. And he told the story and wrote the story kind of later in life when he was on his deathbed. He was named John, and he wrote what we call the Gospel of John. So you got Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the fourth book in the New Testament. So split the book in half. It's the fourth one right after that. John walked around with Jesus. He was a young man at the time. He saw the miracles, he saw the life that Jesus lived, and he was willing to kind of put his life on the line. And in fact, he was one of the only disciples left when Jesus was on the cross. He told the whole story of what happened. But he tells something really interesting about what started this whole process of going to the cross for Jesus that I want to share with you before we tell the Easter story. So here's what happened. John says that Jesus and his followers at the time had come to the city Bethany just outside of Jerusalem. And when he was there, he had come because one of his dear friends had been sick. His name was Lazarus. And his friend Lazarus had died, and he'd been in the grave for quite some time. They'd had the funeral, they'd rolled the stone, the mourners were kind of just about done doing their thing, and so then Jesus rolls into town, and they're upset because they had asked Jesus to come sooner and heal Lazarus. In fact, one of his sisters goes, look, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't be dead. I know you have power to heal. I know you have power to overcome sickness. And if you'd been here, this wouldn't happen. How real is that? That's a pretty visceral story to think about. And again, if you were making this story up, why would you make it up that you were the bad guy that went to Jesus and was upset, right? Because this is the way that it actually happened. So John records that while Jesus was there, he was actually overcome with grief as well, and he raised Lazarus from the dead. He went over to the grave, he knelt down, he cried, and he said, Lazarus, come out. and the stone was rolled away, and out comes Lazarus, still wrapped up in his funeral clothes. Okay, it's crazy, and everybody freaks out. And it says at that moment, many believed in him. Many believed in him. In fact, John said, too many. Too many people believed. Because it was at this moment the religious leaders in Jerusalem go, okay, this guy's got to go. The whole world, in their own words, they say, the whole world is coming after him. The whole world is following him. We cannot let this happen. They felt threatened in their authority. They felt threatened in their power. And let's just face it, Jesus wasn't what they were looking for. Jesus didn't really fit the mold of what they were looking for. They wanted to go about their daily lives. They wanted to do their own thing, and they thought they had everything figured out, really neat, really tidy, in all the boxes that they wanted to be in. And so they plot. And in fact, they're able to corroborate with one of Jesus' closest followers, this guy named Judas, who was one of Jesus' 12. They were able to kind of collaborate and corroborate with him so that eventually they would get Jesus in a place where he was all alone. And when they got him all alone, Judas would betray Jesus. He would point out which one he was so that they could arrest him. Now, you say, why was this necessary? Well, because everywhere Jesus went, a crowd followed him. Thousands and thousands of people. And so they couldn't arrest Jesus because they'd had to go, excuse me, sorry, could you all get out of the way? And then drag Jesus, who was like the center of this crowd, back out in chains. The crowd would have never let that happen. They would have never let it happen. So John said Judas had to pick the perfect moment at the perfect time to betray Jesus when nobody else was around. And that's what he did. And so he's betrayed, he's arrested, he's put in this kind of mock trial. The scriptures tell us early on that he was put at night in trial, and they made up things about him. And in fact, John says their testimonies didn't even match, that some of them were saying one thing and then somebody would say something else that contradicted it. But they'd already had the trial in their mind. Jesus, they wanted him gone. They wanted him to seem guilty. They wanted him to be put away. And so they'd already condemned him before they sat down to hear testimony. And ultimately, they decide that he needs to die. So they send him to Pilate, who was the Roman governor, that next morning. And this would have been early on the Friday morning. They take him to Pilate. Pilate says, I don't see anything wrong with this guy. I don't see any problem with him. And John records that, in fact, Pilate tried to release him. He tried 100 different ways to let Jesus go because he looked into his life. He spoke to him. He said, this guy's okay. There's nothing wrong with him. He hasn't done anything wrong. But because the religious leaders felt so threatened, they kind of riled the crowd up. And finally, Pilate relents, and he has Jesus flogged, which means he was beaten, and then he's handed over to the soldiers to be crucified. And John picks up the story right there. He says this, so the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Carrying his own cross, he went out to the place called the Skull. In other Gospels, if you're reading through, he says the place called Golgotha, this place of the skull. And it says there they crucified him. And with two criminals, one on each side, and Jesus in the middle. So Jesus is crucified on the cross, and this is a really gruesome, horrible way to die. The soldiers are mocking him. They put a crown of thorns on his head. They do everything to make sure that his death was a spectacle. They wanted everyone to see Jesus die. So everyone saw him die. They did it on a high part of town. They did it where it was overlooking the city, and so even if you were down in the city streets, you would see this guy hanging on the cross. And so if you were shouting Hosanna on Palm Sunday, or if you were the guy that was really excited that Jesus could be the king you've been waiting for, everybody knew that wasn't the case. And by this point, the only people that were left kind of around Jesus were still shouting, crucify him, except for maybe a handful of his closest followers, John included, who's writing this story. And so a young man named John is sitting there at the foot of the cross, and he's watching his closest companion, this man that he's seen do miracles, die. And the way that John records it is he says this, finally when it had given way, he bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. He passed. Now John says something really interesting here at this point. I mean, so far, all we've really got is that the teacher, this person who knew a lot of stuff and had been kind of popular, now he's died. And John says something really interesting. Listen to this. He goes, now, the man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. In other words, John's saying, what I'm about to say happened. I saw it. And everything I've said so far, I saw. I was the eyewitness of this. And so what I'm saying, you should believe because I was there and I'm the one giving testimony for it. I'm not writing a story about something that I wasn't there to see. And you're like, well, okay, what is there not to believe so far? The Romans took a guy who they said he was king, they were threatened by him, and they put him on a cross. That sounds pretty easy. And John would go, okay, yeah, but wait. because something's getting ready to change and something's getting ready to make the entire world different. And I'm going to tell you because I saw it, but I'm telling you now that I saw it and you should believe me just so you'll be ready. So after this, it says later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. And he had to do this because the Romans wouldn't allow you to bury somebody who'd been crucified. They were supposed to be an example. So the crosses would literally hang on the side of the road or on the side of the hill with everybody passing by going, don't mess with the Romans. That's what they were a signal. So Joseph of Arimathea asked permission. He must have been a person of great wealth. He must have been a person who had a lot of influence to go straight to Pilate and ask for this. And Pilate was already sympathetic to Jesus because John records that Pilate didn't want to execute him in the first place. So Joseph of Arimathea goes to Pilate, asks for the body, and with Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. And it says he was accompanied by somebody else. It's a name that might be familiar to you if you've read the Gospels before. His name was Nicodemus. Nicodemus was a ruler in the religious authority. He was one of the Jewish rulers, the leaders. He was someone who had a lot of smarts. He was someone who had a lot of connection and authority. And so when Joseph went to take somebody with him, he took Nicodemus. He was the man who had earlier visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. There's so much detail that's listed in the middle of this because John was there and he's writing it down. And so at the place, he says, at the place where Jesus' body, at the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden. And in the garden, a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. So a brand new grave that they were going to put Jesus in. And it says that because it was the day of Jewish preparation, in other words, was the day right before the Sabbath, they weren't allowed to work that day. So John's recording this. He's like, I remember, we were there. It was the day right before Sabbath. We knew if we didn't get something done quick, we were all going to be in trouble. And the religious leaders were already looking for a reason to get rid of all of us. And if we broke the Sabbath, if we did something wrong, then they would cast us out too, and we'd end up on a cross. And so John's like telling the person who's writing this, just remember, this is what happened. I remember all the details. I was there. And it says, and since the tomb was nearby, they just laid Jesus there. And so they roll this giant stone in front of the grave because Pilate was afraid that Jesus' followers would take him out and try to pretend like something had happened when it really hadn't. So they put a giant stone in front of the grave in which Jesus' body was. And then Saturday happens. The disciples are all scattered. Peter's still asleep, probably sobbed himself to sleep the night before. Judas has hanged himself. John and the rest of the disciples are huddled in probably Peter's mother-in-law's house in Capernaum, and they're just trying to figure out how they're going to live on. They're trying to figure out how to go back to normal life because they thought it was over. They weren't in the garden waiting for Jesus to come out of the grave, no matter how many times he'd said he was going to. They thought it was over. And so they're laying in a house. Peter and John, they're there, and they're awakened by someone banging on the door. John records that we were there and we were asleep, and then we heard banging on the door. And at first, he says, at first we thought it was the Romans coming to get us. And then they realized, you know what, the Romans don't knock on doors, they just knock down doors, and so it can't be them. So Peter and John, they go to the door, and when they find there is Mary. And listen to what Mary says to them at the door. He says, look, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him. Again, they just think grave robbery. They're not thinking resurrection. They're not thinking that Jesus has been miraculously resurrected. They think someone stole his body. They're still trying to have a funeral. They still thought this whole thing was over with. And so Mary says, look, they've taken him, and I don't know where they put him. It's gone. The stone has been rolled away, and he's not there. So Peter and John, they take off running. It says Peter and the other disciple, who is John, started for the tomb. They started off running together. Both were running. And I love this. But the other disciple, John, outran Peter. I have a theory, okay? So John is an old man at this point. He's writing this story. And I think that he looked at the person dictating and says, make sure you put in there that I beat Peter there. You know, like, they need to know that. Peter's already dead and gone at this point. He's not going to care. Listen, I beat Peter there. Make sure you write that down. But again, John's a young man at this point. So it says he outran Peter and he reached the tomb first. But he bent over. He looked inside at the strips of linen lying there, but he did not go in. And you say, well, why? Well, because it's a cemetery and it's an open grave. And John's a young guy going, I ain't going in there. Like, I don't know what's happened, but it's not good. But Peter, on the other hand, finally catches up, and he's much more bold. He's much more courageous. He's much more emotional. I'm going to do my thing, and I'm going to get there, and like I got to run in. And Peter had already had this moment where he denied Jesus, and he felt really guilty about that. So he wanted to know what had actually happened. And so John is kind of like peering in the door, and Peter just comes running in. He came along beside. He went straight in the tomb. And he saw the strips of linen, right, that were laying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still laying in its place, separate from the linen, so it had been kind of folded off to the side. And so then finally John musters up the courage. It says, finally the other disciple reached the tomb first. Again, I want to point that out. Remember, I was there first. Make sure they write that down. Also went inside. And this is beautiful because this is John's formula. If you ever read John's gospel, you're going to see a statement like what he's about to say here that he says over and over again. You see, John, and I'm going to read this for you in a minute, said that the only reason he was writing these stories down, all right, he's an old man on his deathbed at this point. He's dictating to someone. He's saying, write this down. Make sure you get it like this. The only reason, he says, is so that you would believe. So it says that John, who got there first, he went in and he saw. He saw that the cloth was gone. He saw that the body was gone, but the cloth was still there. He saw that the grave was empty and the stone had been rolled away. And then listen to this. This is beautiful. He saw and believed. See, at that moment, it wasn't about a funeral anymore. And at that moment, it wasn't about like maybe this guy was, really cool teacher, but now this whole movement is over. Now it wasn't like, what was that parable about again? Maybe we should tell people that story. Now it was the entire world is different. And something that should not have happened has happened, and I believe. And John went from a guy who was huddled in the closet upstairs, fearful for his own life, to a man who was willing to go to prison forever, being willing to be condemned to death, being willing to be put to death, because I said, I will not stop talking about the fact that Jesus has been raised from the dead. He is alive. Now, I want to tell you one more piece of this story, then I'm done. This is kind of the end and the point, okay? And this is maybe where you find yourself this morning. You see, John saw, and he believed. And then he wrote this story down that thousands of years later, here we are this morning on Easter Sunday morning telling the story again. And I'm going to guess, I could be wrong, and forgive me if I am, but I'm going to guess that most of us in the room have heard this story before. You may have even grown up hearing this story. And this may be the story that you might not know about the Bible, but you know a lot about this story. And it's a story that you hear people tell all the time. And maybe it's nothing more than a story to you. But here's the thing. No matter what you think about the Old Testament, no matter what you think about the historicity of other things, the truth of the matter is something happened. And you owe it to yourself to answer that one simple question. And John says that he wrote his whole gospel. He put this whole thing together so that you would answer that question and realize that he's worth believing in. And to prove it, he tells one more story that does not paint the disciples in a very good light. And in fact, if I'm telling this story and I'm making it up, I don't include this story. Because it does, never once do they write themselves in as heroes. They don't write themselves in as guys who should be looked up to. They tell the truth, that they didn't believe, and that they thought he died, and that they didn't understand, and that when Jesus begged them to pray, they fell asleep. And then he tells this story. It says that a week later, right, Thomas, just a week before, had been saying to his group of people, listen, I don't believe this stuff. You say Jesus has come out of the grave. I don't believe it. And in fact, I'm never going to believe it until I can touch his side and I can feel the holes in his hands. And maybe you're there. You're like, this is a cool story. It's a cool story, but I'm not going to believe it until I can see it. And so John records that he said that. He said, yeah, you know what? I'm not going to believe it until I see it. So a week later, right after all this, there's so much detail that John is leaving us. A week later, they were in the house again. And Thomas, the one who didn't believe, was with them. And it says, though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. And you're like, well, why did he say that? Well, because he just walked through a locked door. Of course they're going to be like scared out of their minds. Like, hey, calm down, guys. It's me. I'm here. And then he looks right at Thomas, who was kind of like cynical about the whole thing, who was kind of like nervous about the whole thing. And he says, here, put your finger here. See my hands? Reach out your hand and put it into my side. It's me. And then he says a phrase that's kind of weird. In Greek, it makes sense in Greek, but in English it gets kind of jumbled. So I translated it and I'm going to walk through it. But this is what it says. Don't be unbelieving, be believing. Don't be unbelieving, but believing. Like, don't worry about this whole thing anymore. Like, believe me, I'm here. See, it's me. Don't be unbelieving, be believing. And Thomas answered and said to him, my Lord and my God. See, I think Jesus knew that we all have doubts. I do. I think that. I think Jesus understood that all of us have times and moments of doubts. And I think doubt is a part of faith. Maybe you've never heard that before. Maybe that's a comfort to you. But I think you can't really have faith if there wasn't something that had to have, the option of doubt in the midst of that. And so Jesus was basically looking at his disciples saying, like, don't give him a nickname, even though we did, right? Don't call him Doubting Thomas. You all have doubted. You've all been cynical about this whole thing. But here I am. Don't be unbelieving, be believing. And that's an invitation from Jesus himself. Don't be unbelieving, be believing. And then Jesus peers through history. They're sitting in this little room, and they're still trying to figure out what's going to happen next. But Jesus, he speaks through space and time and all of that, and he says something that is meaningful for you, and you, and you, and you, and me. He says this, because you have seen me, you have believed. But blessed are those who have not seen, and yet have believed. There's going to come a time, Jesus said, when a group of people are going to be gathered together, and they're going to call it Easter, right? What are you talking about? Just go with me, okay? There's going to be a group of people who are going to be gathered together. They're going to tell this story, and they won't have seen me, and they won't have the option to put their hands in the hole that is in my hand. They won't have their option to touch me and feel that I'm actually here, but they're going to believe because they've been invited to, and they're going to tell the story that you're going to help them tell, and one day they're going to realize that I'm their Lord and their God too. And then John wraps the whole thing up in a nice bow, and he says, Jesus did a lot of other things in the presence of his disciples that we saw. We saw him do this. And they're not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing, this is beautiful. Not just so that you can build a church. Not just so that you can say that you got a club. Not just so that you can wear pretty clothes and tell the story on Easter. No. That you might believe, and by believing you might have life in his name. Here's what I know. It's true about me, so it's got to be true about you. Life loves to chew us up and spit us out. And some of us, especially those of us with young kids, like I got 4 of my own, I bless you, me too, we feel like we're stuck in this grind. That life is just one more box to check after another, after another, after another. Get the kids to soccer practice, get the kids to soccer, get them to softball, make sure they get home from school. I got to go to work, we got to make money, we got to pay bills. We should probably exercise so that we can live longer and see our grandchildren. It's this stuff over and over and over and over. I don't think that's really what life is all about. Now, I'm not saying don't take your kids to softball, okay? That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is, what if this invitation to believe is so that you might experience life? And what if the thing you feel like you're missing this morning is actually the exact thing that Jesus wanted to give you all along? And maybe, just maybe, the story of Easter is not just about all the pretty flowers and all the cool clothes and all the people coming together to tell the story. What if it's actually about you having the opportunity to believe something that would bring you life? And what if today is that day? Now, we're going to sing a song in just a minute. The band's going to come back out, and it's one of my favorites because it's become an anthem through our last series. In fact, we sang it last Sunday, I think. But it's about basically testifying, this testimony. This is what my life is all about. And saying that Jesus has done something for me, and I can't not talk about it. And if you're in this room this morning and you're still kind of cynical about the story, you are surrounded with people who have come to know and to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And they've come here because they know what he has done for them. And what if what he's done for them, he could do for you too? What if, as we sing this song about testifying that Jesus really is who he says he is, and that it'll be our testimony through all the ages, what if that could be your story too? That's the invitation. That is the invitation of Easter. It's an invitation for you to believe. Would you bow your heads with me? Let me pray for you. Father God, I just thank you so much for these people and for this great, great day that we've had to celebrate and tell your story. God, it's your story, and you've invited us to live into it. God, there's people listening to my voice or here gathered this morning who don't believe yet. God, I just ask that you would just speak to them clearly, that you would just make your presence known to them, and that they can realize that maybe the life, the satisfaction, the hope they've been looking for, that's missing because they don't have you yet. And God, help us in the midst of this time, that in the midst of our doubts, in the midst of our questions, that we wouldn't just say, we don't know the answer, that we would say, we don't know the answer yet. And we'd find an opportunity to seek out an opportunity to believe in you. God, we ask these things in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Have a great week. Be sure and take a photo out by we set up a little photo booth for you guys in this corner out here with the cross. Be sure to take a photo there. We have a children's photo booth to your right this way. Thank you guys so much.